My name is Laura Bianchi. In the afternoon, my own aunt refused to hug me at my mother's 80th birthday party, telling me flatly that some of us actually show up for family instead of just sending checks from far away. Was also the afternoon I first understood that my brother had spent 3 years quietly building a story about me that had almost nothing to do with the truth. The party was held in the backyard of my mother's house in Akron, the same modest colonial where Vince and I had grown up, where my late father had built a small patio himself the summer before he passed. I'd flown in from Denver 2 days earlier, brought a cake I'd ordered from the bakery my mother had always loved, and arrived early to help set up folding chairs before the rest of the extended family started showing up. My Aunt Connie, my mother's younger sister, arrived around 1 o'clock, and I went to greet her the way I always had, and she stepped back slightly from my embrace, her expression carrying something I'd never seen directed at me before. "Laura," she said my name carefully, almost formally. "I'm surprised you found the time to come." "Of course I came, Aunt Connie. It's Mom's 80th. She looked past me toward the yard, where several other relatives were already gathering. "Vince mentioned you'd probably send your regrets again, the way you usually do. Guess he was wrong this time." I stood there, genuinely confused, trying to process what she'd just said. "Aunt Connie, I visit 4 or 5 times a year. I call Mom every single Sunday. What exactly did Vince tell you?" She looked at me with an expression that had softened slightly, though not entirely, something closer to uncertain pity than outright hostility. "He's told all of us, honey, for a while now, that you'd sort of checked out since you moved away. That he's the one managing everything for your mother, day to day, and that you mostly just call occasionally and send a little money now and then when it's convenient for you." I felt something cold settle into my stomach, a feeling I would spend the following weeks trying to fully understand. "That's not remotely true, Aunt Connie. I send Mom $1,500 every single month. I've flown here for every single holiday and every major appointment for the last 3 years. I don't understand where any of this is coming from." My aunt's expression shifted again, uncertainty giving way to something more genuinely troubled. "Laura, I don't know what to tell you. Vince has said the same thing to me, to your Uncle Ray, to half the family, for at least a year now. If what you're saying is true, I don't understand why he'd be telling all of us something so different. I want to back up considerably further than that backyard party to explain how my own brother built an entire false narrative about my absence from our mother's life, while quietly, methodically, doing something to her finances that none of the rest of us discovered until it was almost too late to fully undo. I grew up in that same house in Akron with my brother Vince, 2 years younger than me, and I want to be honest that our relationship, even in childhood, carried a certain complicated undercurrent that I think, looking back, foreshadowed some of what eventually unfolded between us as adults. Vince struggled academically in ways I never did, and I think our parents, without ever intending any unfairness, held up my own steadier path, good grades, a nursing scholarship to Ohio State, as an implicit standard that Vince often felt he was failing to meet, a comparison that bred, over the years, a quiet resentment I don't think either of us fully named out loud until circumstances eventually forced it into the open. Our father, Anthony Bianchi, worked 30 years for a tire manufacturing plant before passing 11 years ago, a heart attack that took him quickly and left our mother, Rose, a devoted homemaker for most of her adult life, suddenly navigating widowhood and household finances, largely on her own for the first time in decades. I'd married my husband Daniel 3 years before my father's death, and about a year after the funeral, Daniel's company offered him a significant promotion that required relocating to Denver, an opportunity I encouraged him to take, partly because the professional advancement mattered considerably to both of us, and partly because I'd built my own nursing career to a point where a hospital system in Denver offered me a hospice care leadership position I found genuinely meaningful. I want to be honest that leaving my mother in Ohio, particularly so soon after my father's death, was one of the harder decisions of my adult life, and I made it only after extensive conversations with Vince, who assured me, at the time, that he was fully willing and able to take on a more central role in checking in on our mother locally, given that he lived only 15 minutes from her house while I would now be nearly 1,400 miles away. I established, from the very beginning of that arrangement, a consistent pattern of support that I maintained without fail over the following 8 years. I called my mother every single Sunday evening, conversations that typically lasted 30 to 45 minutes. I transferred $1,500 into her checking account on the first of every month, an amount I'd calculated, with her input, as a meaningful contribution toward her ongoing living expenses beyond her modest pension and Social Security income. I flew back to Akron for every major holiday, for her birthday every year, and for any significant medical appointment she asked me to attend, arrangements that typically required me to use considerable amounts of my own vacation time and, on more than a few occasions, unpaid leave beyond what my accrued time allowed. Vince, in the years following my move to Denver, took on what appeared, from a distance, to be a genuinely helpful local role, stopping by our mother's house regularly, handling some of the more immediate practical tasks that benefited from physical proximity, yard work, minor home repairs, driving her to routine appointments that didn't require my presence. About 4 years ago, Vince suggested, during one of our periodic three-way phone calls with our mother, that it might make practical sense for him to be added as a joint account holder on her primary checking account, framing the suggestion as a convenience measure that would allow him to help manage her bill payments and handle any financial matters that arose, while she was dealing with a knee replacement surgery she had scheduled that same year. I want to be honest that I supported this suggestion at the time, genuinely believing it represented a sensible, practical arrangement, given Vince's local proximity and our mother's temporary reduced mobility following the surgery. I had no reason, at that point, to suspect anything beyond straightforward filial assistance. What I didn't know, and wouldn't fully understand for nearly 3 more years, was that this joint account arrangement gave Vince access that he began, gradually and then increasingly significantly, to exploit for his own financial benefit, entirely separate from any legitimate household management purpose. Vince's own financial life, I would learn much later through the discovery process that eventually unfolded, had been under considerable strain for several years by that point. He'd opened a used car dealership about 6 years earlier that had struggled from nearly its inception, compounded by what I would eventually learn was a serious gambling habit that had accumulated substantial debt well beyond what his dealership's inconsistent revenue could sustain. I began noticing small, confusing signs over the following 2 years that something wasn't quite adding up, though I want to be honest that I initially attributed these signs to ordinary aging and forgetfulness on my mother's part rather than anything more concerning. She'd occasionally mention, during our Sunday calls, some confusion about a bill she thought she'd already paid, or express uncertainty about whether a particular expense had come from her own funds or from money I'd sent, small inconsistencies that, taken individually, seemed unremarkable enough to dismiss. The person who first raised a genuine specific concern with me was Denise Okafor, a home health aide, who began coming to my mother's house 3 days a week about 2 years ago, initially to assist with some mobility exercises following a minor fall, and who, over time, developed the kind of close, attentive relationship with my mother that made her, in practice, one of the people most consistently present in her daily life, considerably more consistently than Vince himself, as it would eventually emerge. Denise called me directly about 8 months before that difficult birthday party, her voice carrying a careful, measured concern. "Mrs. Sorensen, I don't want to overstep, but I've noticed some things over the last several months that I think you should know about, as your mother's daughter. There have been several occasions where bills have gone unpaid, despite your mother clearly having adequate funds, based on what she's told me directly about her monthly income and your own contributions. I've also noticed some paperwork around the house, loan documents from a company I don't recognize, that your mother doesn't seem to fully understand or remember signing, though her signature appears to be on them." I want to describe my reaction to that call honestly, because it marked the beginning of a period of investigation that would reveal considerably more than I'd initially feared. I asked Denise if she'd be willing to help me gather more specific information the next time she visited, and over the following several weeks, working carefully and respectfully within the boundaries of her role, she was able to identify several concerning documents in my mother's house, including a home equity line of credit taken out against the house on Larchmere Street, the same house my father had paid off entirely nearly 15 years earlier, for an amount just under $60,000, dated approximately 18 months earlier. I called the bank directly, working through the appropriate verification channels as my mother's authorized representative, and requested a full accounting of activity on both the joint checking account and any other accounts associated with my mother's information. What I discovered, over the following weeks of gathering statements and documentation, painted a picture considerably more troubling than I had initially imagined. Vince had been making regular, substantial withdrawals from the joint checking account for nearly 3 years, amounts that, taken cumulatively, totaled just over $140,000, withdrawals disguised, in the account's transaction history, as a rotating series of seemingly ordinary household expenses, though the actual destination of those funds, once I began cross-referencing the withdrawal dates and amounts against Vince's own known financial pressures, traced clearly back to his failing dealership and, based on subsequent records I would eventually obtain, a series of payments to online gambling platforms and a local casino, the home equity line of credit represented a separate and in some ways more troubling discovery. Vince had apparently accompanied our mother to a bank appointment approximately 18 months earlier, during a period when her early cognitive changes, though not yet formally diagnosed, had already begun to make her somewhat more suggestible and less able to fully scrutinize complex financial paperwork than she once had been. The loan had been taken out in her name alone, with Vince present as what the bank's records described as an accompanying family member, and the funds, once disbursed, had been transferred within days into an account associated with Vince's dealership business. I want to be honest about the particular anguish of piecing together this evidence over those weeks, discovering the actual scope of what my brother had been doing to our mother's finances while, simultaneously and with what I can only describe as a considerable degree of calculated cruelty, telling the rest of our extended family that I was the one who had abandoned her. I asked Denise, once I'd gathered enough documentation to feel confident about the overall pattern, whether she had any insight into how the rumor about my supposed absence had spread so thoroughly through the family. "I've heard your brother talk to your mother about it directly, actually," Denise told me during one of our increasingly frequent phone calls as this situation unfolded. "He's mentioned to her, more than once when I've been present, some version of good thing I'm the one who actually shows up, since Laura's too busy with her own life out in Denver. Comments that, I have to say, your mother has sometimes repeated back to other family members herself, not out of any malice, but because I think her own memory of your actual involvement has become genuinely confused by how consistently and confidently Vince has repeated this narrative to her directly. This detail, once I fully understood it, explains something that had initially confused me considerably. Why even my own mother, during a phone call about 2 weeks before that birthday party, had made a passing comment that suggested she, too, had absorbed some version of Vince's narrative about my relative absence. "Mom," I'd asked her carefully during that call, "do you feel like I don't visit enough or don't call enough?" "Oh, I don't know, sweetheart," she'd said, her tone carrying an uncertainty that, in hindsight, reflected the early cognitive changes that would eventually be formally diagnosed as mild vascular dementia. "Vince always says you're just so busy out there. I know you send money. That's very generous of you. I just wish I saw you more, is all." I want to walk through what happened once I'd assembled what I believed was a comprehensive picture of the actual financial situation. Because the confrontation that followed, both with Vince directly and eventually with the broader family, represents the formal reckoning this entire situation had been building toward. I flew back to Akron about 3 weeks after that difficult birthday party, having spent the intervening weeks working with an elder law attorney named Patricia Ashworth, who helped me understand the legal options available for both protecting my mother's remaining assets and pursuing accountability for what had already been taken. I confronted Vince directly first, at his own house rather than at a family gathering, wanting the initial conversation to happen privately before any broader family reckoning took place. "Vince, I need you to explain to me what's happened to Mom's accounts over the last 3 years, and I need you to be honest, because I've already gathered the bank statements and the loan documents, and I already know considerably more than you probably think I know." Vince's initial reaction was defensive, an attempt to characterize the withdrawals as legitimate household expenses that I simply didn't understand given my distance from the day-to-day reality of caring for our mother locally. "Laura, you don't know what it's actually like, being the one who's here every single day, dealing with everything, while you send a check once a month and call it support. I've sent $1,500 every single month for 8 years, Vince. I've flown here for every major holiday and every significant appointment. And meanwhile, you've apparently spent 3 years telling Aunt Connie, Uncle Ray, and God knows who else in this family, that I've abandoned Mom while you were quietly draining $140,000 out of her checking account and taking out a $60,000 loan against her house, using money that traces directly back to your dealership and, from what I've been able to determine, some fairly significant gambling debts. Vince's composure, which had remained defensively intact through most of the initial exchange, finally cracked at that specific accounting. The dealership was going to fail completely, Laura. I was drowning. I told myself, at first, that I was just borrowing against what would eventually be my share of the inheritance anyway, that it wasn't really stealing if it was money that would come to me eventually regardless. That's not how any of this works, Vince, and you know it. Mom is still alive. That money belonged to her, for her own care, her own security, not for you to quietly access because you convinced yourself of some justification that let you avoid admitting how badly you'd mismanaged your own finances. I know, Vince said, his voice breaking. I know how it sounds, laid out like that. And the story about me abandoning her? Why would you do that, on top of everything else? Vince was quiet for a long moment before answering, and I want to describe his explanation honestly, because I believe it revealed something genuinely troubling about the psychology underneath his actions, even as it offered no real excuse for them. I think, he finally said, some part of me needed everyone to believe I was the good one, the one who actually showed up, especially once I started taking the money, and needed some story that made what I was doing feel less like theft and more like fair compensation for being the sibling who was actually present. If everyone believed you'd checked out, then what I was doing felt, in some twisted way, like it was owed to me for carrying a burden you weren't sharing. I think I needed that story to be true, so I built it, and once I started telling it, it got easier to keep telling, because it let me avoid facing what I was actually doing. I want to be honest that hearing this explanation didn't soften my reaction to what he'd done, though it did help me understand, with somewhat more clarity, the particular mechanism by which financial desperation and a need for self-justification had fed into each other over those 3 years. I informed Vince that I intended to report the situation to Adult Protective Services and to pursue legal action to recover the misappropriated funds, both to protect what remained of our mother's assets and to formally establish, through legal process, the actual truth of what had happened, given how thoroughly his false narrative had spread through the rest of the family. The following weeks involved a formal investigation, both through Adult Protective Services and through Patricia Ashworth's office, gathering comprehensive documentation of the full scope of the financial exploitation, working with a forensic accountant who confirmed the pattern of withdrawals and traced them definitively to Vince's dealership and gambling accounts. I organized a family meeting about 6 weeks after my initial confrontation with Vince, at our mother's house with Aunt Connie, Uncle Ray, and several other close relatives present, along with Patricia Ashworth, who helped present the documented evidence clearly and methodically. I want to describe that meeting in some detail, because it represented the moment the family's entire understanding of the previous several years finally shifted, painfully but decisively, toward the actual truth. Patricia walked the assembled family through the bank statements, the timeline of withdrawals, the home equity loan documentation, and the connection to Vince's dealership finances, presenting the material with the same careful, methodical precision she'd have used in a formal legal proceeding. Aunt Connie, watching this presentation unfold, grew visibly more troubled as the full scope of the evidence emerged. Vince told all of us for years that Laura barely called, barely visited, barely helped at all. Are you telling me that wasn't true? I provided, at that point, my own documentation, phone records showing the consistent weekly calls, bank transfer records showing the monthly contributions, flight records showing the regular visits for holidays and appointments, a body of evidence that, laid alongside Vince's actual financial exploitation, painted a picture that could no longer be reasonably disputed. Uncle Ray, Vince's own uncle by marriage, looked at him directly across the room. Vince, you've spent 3 years telling this family your sister abandoned your mother while you were stealing from her. I don't even know what to say to you right now. Vince, sitting through this presentation, offered what I want to describe honestly as a genuine, if painfully overdue, acknowledgement of the full scope of what he'd done admitting directly to the assembled family that the narrative about my absence had been a deliberate fabrication, constructed specifically to obscure and justify his own financial exploitation of our mother. "I'm not going to sit here and make excuses," he said, his voice unsteady. "I stole from Mom over and over for 3 years, and I lied about my sister to make myself feel less guilty about it and to make sure nobody looked too closely at what I was actually doing. I don't expect anyone in this room to forgive me quickly, or maybe at all, but I need everyone to understand clearly that what I said about Laura was false, completely false, and she deserves better than what my lies put her through with this family." I want to walk through what happened in the months following that family meeting, because the resolution, much like some of the more serious situations I've come to understand happen within families facing this kind of financial exploitation, didn't arrive as a simple, tidy reconciliation. Vince faced formal legal consequences, working through a negotiated settlement with the district attorney's office that required him to enter a structured restitution plan to repay the misappropriated funds over time, alongside a period of probation, given the absence of any prior criminal history and the relatively cooperative posture he ultimately took once confronted with the full body of evidence. Patricia Ashworth helped establish a new, more carefully structured financial arrangement for our mother's remaining assets, removing Vince entirely from any account access and establishing a trust, with myself and a neutral professional fiduciary serving as co-trustees, designed specifically to prevent any similar exploitation going forward, particularly important given our mother's diagnosed cognitive decline, which made her, the elder law attorney explained clearly, considerably more vulnerable to this kind of exploitation than she had been in earlier years. My relationship with our mother, once the truth fully emerged, required its own careful rebuilding, given how thoroughly Vince's narrative had, over time, distorted her own confused understanding of my actual level of involvement in her life. I want to be honest that this rebuilding process has taken considerable time and patience, particularly given the added complexity of her cognitive decline, which sometimes makes it difficult for her to fully retain or process the corrected understanding even after we've discussed it directly. "I'm sorry I ever doubted how much you've been there for me," she told me, during one clearer conversation several months after the family meeting. "I don't fully understand how I got so confused about it, but I understand now and I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize, Mom," I told her. "Vince told you something over and over, and it's not your fault that you believed him." My relationship with Vince, I want to be honest, remains considerably more strained and uncertain than my relationship with our mother has managed to become. He has, to his credit, maintained consistent compliance with his restitution obligations and his probation terms over the following year, and he reached out to me directly about 4 months after the family meeting, asking if we could meet to begin what he described as an attempt to understand and address whatever had allowed him to justify what he'd done for so long. "I've started seeing a counselor," he told me, during that meeting, specifically to work through the gambling and the financial desperation that led to all of this. "I don't expect you to trust me again anytime soon, maybe not ever fully. But I wanted you to know I'm not just serving out a legal obligation. I'm actually trying to understand how I became a person capable of doing what I did, to Mom and to you." I appreciated that effort, though I told him honestly that rebuilding any real trust between us would require considerable time, verified through consistent action, rather than any single conversation, however sincere it might be in the moment. Denise Okafor, throughout this entire process, remained a steady, invaluable presence, continuing her regular visits with our mother and providing, through her consistent daily observation, an ongoing layer of protection and accountability that gave me considerable peace of mind given the distance that still separates me from Ohio on a daily basis. "Your mother's lucky to have you fighting for her the way you have," Denise told me during one of our now regular check-in calls. "A lot of families, once a rumor like that gets going, never bother to actually dig into whether it's true. You did the harder thing, and it mattered." I flew back to Akron last month for another visit, one of the now regular trips I've continued making despite everything that's happened, and I sat with my mother on that same back patio my father had built decades earlier, watching her work through a crossword puzzle with the particular slow, careful concentration her condition now requires, and I understood something I don't think I'd have understood as clearly without that painful moment at her birthday party. standing in a backyard full of relatives who'd absorbed a story about me that had almost nothing to do with the truth. A lie, told confidently and repeated often enough, can travel considerably faster and further than the quiet, unremarkable truth of a person, simply showing up, week after week, in ways that don't generate much visible fanfare. But the truth, however slow it sometimes is to fully surface, still holds. Eventually, if you're willing to do the difficult work of gathering the actual evidence, rather than simply accepting the more convenient story everyone else has already decided to believe. If this story reminded you of a family rumor about yourself, or someone you love that never quite added up, or an elderly parent whose finances might benefit from an independent review, especially if one family member has taken on primary financial management responsibilities without much outside oversight, it might be worth asking for a full accounting sooner rather than later, before either the money or the truth becomes considerably harder to recover. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true stories about family, truth, and the quiet, persistent work of setting the record straight.